Shalom, and welcome back to another class on Journey Through the Bible. We are in the 8th chapter of the first book of Kings, and we are discussing the rise and the success and the prominence of King Solomon. And we see him in all his glory, in all his wisdom, in all his God-fearing in chapter 8, chapter 9, and especially, and we'll talk about it next week, in chapter 10. Chapter 8 is after the building of the temple, which took many years. Shlomo gathers the people of Israel. Yakel, right? He gathered the people of Israel. If we remember the word Yakel, it's the same thing Moses did. When did Moses do this? He did it after the sin of the golden calf. And what happened after the sin of the golden calf? The people were all spread out. The people scattered. The people felt bad. The people were embarrassed. So Moshe needed to reunite the people, and that's with the word vayakel. He gathered them all together. Shlomo does it in his way. Remember that during David's time, and certainly at the end, it was very tumultuous. And there was a couple of coups, a couple of sons tried to take away the kingdom. There was bloodshed. So Solomon needs to do the same thing, Yakel. He needs to gather the people together and to unite them. How does he do it? Lahalot et Aron Brit Hashem Meir David Hitzion, to bring up the Ark of the Covenant from the city of David to the Temple Mount. It's a very short distance, obviously. I mean, if we've been to the city of David, we know that when David was alive, he had the Ark of the Covenant housed there, temporarily, but he always wanted to be permanent, and now Shlomo is going to bring it permanently. When does he do this? In the month of Etanim, the 7th month, during the festival of Sukkot. In the Torah, the word Chag implies the festival of Sukkot. So it's the 15th of the month, and he decides to make this special event, and the priests lifted the ark, and they bring it, and the whole Mishkan and the tabernacle, all the things that were related to the temporary house of God. And the Kohanim and the priests, they bring it, and the king Shlomo and all of Israel are offering sacrifices, and we couldn't even count them, and they're, very excited, and they're celebrating. And the Kohanim come, and they bring the Aron Brit Hashem to the Dvir. Dvir is another name for the temple, or a certain place in the temple. El Kodesh HaKodeshim, El Tachat Kanfei HaKruvim. Remember, we had the cherubim, we had the house of God, and in the house of God there were different. There was 2/3 of it was called the Chatzer or the Ulam, the Heichal. But then 1/3 was called the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies. And in that Holy of Holies, who was sitting there? The Kruvim, these cherubim that were facing each other. And they put the ark underneath it. And we remember that the presence of God was going to speak in between it. The cherubim had their wings spread out over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim shielded the ark and its poles from above. You can imagine they're kind of the wings of these angel-looking babies golden ones were covering the ark. You'll ask me, why is there a picture of cherubim in the holiest place in the world? What are these statues of cherubim? When God himself commanded, there shall be no statues, there shall be no pesel, there shall be no idols, there shall be no nothing. And I'll give the same answer that is the answer of why there's a temple in the first place. And the people needed to have some representation And therefore, who's going to guard the holy ark other than the image of purity and angel? They are guardians in the minds of the people. And therefore, these guardians protected the ark, and between these guardians, God spoke. What was in the ark? The answer is the luchot avanim, the two tablets of stone that were from Chorev, from Mount Sinai. When they left Egypt. Now that's a few hundred years earlier, so they kept it obviously very carefully and very respectfully, although sometimes less so. So they were punished for that, if we recall our history. And they kept these two luchot in there. Now, elsewhere in perhaps the Bible, but certainly in the Talmud, they said that there were two other things that were kept in the Holy Ark. What was kept in the Holy Ark? Anyone want to take a guess? So one thing we know, that the stone tablets, correct. What's the two other things? So the answer is that the Talmud says that the broken tablets were also in the ark. Luchot v'shivrei luchot. The tablets that Moshe made and the tablets that God fashioned that Moshe destroyed, or he broke, into pieces. The third thing that was, according to the Talmud, in the ark was the portion of manna. Heavenly manna, that was also considered holy to be put in the ark. Interesting. What happened to the ark? According to the Torah, the Bible that we're going to learn later on in history, hundreds of years later, one of the kings buries the treasures of the ark in a mountain, and humanity has been looking for the treasures of the ark ever since. As soon as the Kohanim leave the holy, the cloud of the glory of God fills the entire kingdom, or the entire house of God. And verse 11, the priests could not return, or they couldn't stand. They couldn't stay there because the house is filled with the glory of God. The presence of God is too much for people to handle. Then Shlomo speaks, and I gave this class a little bit in Polish yesterday. Shlomo speaks and says, God has chosen to sit and abide in this thick cloud, Ba'arafel, which is, in the presence of God is upon us. And I built a house for you, God, a place where you may dwell forever. I mentioned yesterday that the people of Israel were convinced that forever meant forever, and the power of God is too eternal for anything to go wrong with it, and therefore they can sin as much as they want because God's presence will never go away, which is false. The whole congregation of Israel standing, the king faced and blessed the entire congregation of Israel, and he said, Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael asher diber b'fiv v'tiver yadai le'mor. Blessed is God who fulfilled the promise he made to my father when he said that I chose David to be the king, and I was with David all his life. And regarding your intention to build the temple, you will not, but your son will. I mentioned in the class that that's either a punishment or it's saying, no, you're lucky enough to have your son continue your mission. You started it and your son will will conclude it, and that's very nice. And it sounds that way here. It doesn't sound like he's punishing him. And lo and behold, he fulfilled the promise that he made. I succeeded my father David, ascended the throne of Israel, built a house for the name of the Lord, placed a place for set a place for the ark with the covenant inside. He said, basically, I did exactly what was requested of me. And then Shlomo says the following. First, he lifts up his hands towards the heavens and he says, Vayomar Adonai Elahei Yisrael, Ein kamoch Elohim, b'shamayim imal v'al haaretz v'tachat. There is no one like you, O God, in the heavens above, in the earth below. Your gracious covenant walking before you. You've kept the promises you made to King David, my father. And now, he says, O God, please keep the promise that you made, continue to keep it, on the condition that your children will follow in the proper path. Let the promise you made to your servant, my father, be fulfilled. Then Solomon gets a little philosophical. And he says, is it possible that you're going to dwell in one place? The heavens cannot contain you. How is it possible that this house will be able to contain you? And I think King Solomon wants to teach the people here that this is not that we're jailing God, we're constricting him, confining him to these four walls. That would be absurd. That would be, heresy to say such a thing. What does it mean? It means that God has chosen one place, one point throughout all over the world that he will turn his face towards his people. And when the people pray to you, God, you will hear. May your eyes be open day and night towards this house, towards a place of which you have said, my name shall abide there. And this is the theme of this chapter. These words, Vishamata el tchinat avdecha, you will listen. You will hear our pleas and our prayers. The theory is, on some philosophical dimension, that what if we knew as a nation or as humanity that there's always one place where we have a direct line to God? What would that do to us as a nation? What would that do to us as people in the world who are constantly searching and constantly wondering and constantly struggling to know that there is nevertheless one place? The Greeks had the same idea when they had this idea of the oracle, right? What was the oracle? In your regular life, there are doubts and there's gray and there's, complicated matters. But if you really, really need an answer, then just go to the oracle. Now, you may not understand it, and it may be difficult, and it may be difficult to get there, but nevertheless, know that exists. What a comforting message that we have a place that God will hear. It doesn't mean that's the place where God is. That's absurd. It means that there is a place where there is a higher concentration because of a promise that from there God will hear our voice. This theme of God hearing our voice and the inverse of God no longer hearing our voice due to our sins runs through the entire Bible. For King Solomon, and on some level through all the biblical personalities, the idea that the Almighty hears is revolutionary. ancient, polytheism, they had these idols that they created. They had the sun and the moon. They had these fixed objects. So they were certainly more grandiose and more powerful. But did they hear? In other religions and cultures, they had God-like beings that they offered prayers to, that they offered sacrifices to. But Shlomo says the point of the temple is it is a place where God hears. And verse 30 repeats it, and it's repeated the next 6 times. V'ata tishma el lakom shitachal hashamayim v'shamata v'salachta. In this one verse, the word shomea, to hear, appears 3 times. You will hear, you will hear, you will hear. You will listen, you will listen, you will listen. And now Shlomo begins his kind of prayer or his speech about the nature of the Beit HaMikdash. When we talk about what it means to have a Beit HaMikdash and now what it means to not have the Beit HaMikdash, I think it needs to focus on this exact point. Having a Beit HaMikdash means that God is hearing on a higher dimension, because he said that that's what he's going to set up there. Not having a Beit Mikdash, that hearing is muted, and that's a frightening thing, that God is not hearing, listening to our prayers. And the rabbis throughout history trying to struggle with this question, to what extent he hears and to what extent he chooses not to hear. We can ask the same question: what exactly means God hears prayers? Because that relates to the philosophical dimension of whether God, obviously God doesn't respond positively to every time we have a prayer. We ask to win the lottery, and the next day we don't win the lottery, so we have to ask ourselves, So the classic answer is, well, God may say no, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't listen, he doesn't hear. That's a nice idea. It doesn't sound like that's what King Solomon is asking for. In the biblical times, to hear means to respond. No question about that. But of course, biblical time is different, because biblical time, the divine presence was tangible, was experienced by people. And they heard the voice of God, and they saw the images. And that's what prophecy is about. The immanence of God, right? With one great exception being the book of Esther, right? Where God's name is not mentioned. But so biblical prophecies in the books of the Bible, when God hears, he responds. Now, he either responds positively or negatively, depending on your actions, but he hears and he responds. What is he hearing? Now, the chapter goes on for 30 more verses. Okay. Verse 31, whenever one man commits an offense against another, and the latter utters a curse, that curse, will come to your altar in your temple, and you will hear in heaven and take action and judge, condemning the one who's wrong and bringing down the punishment. So on the first thing that happens, okay, is that God's hearing is about judging. One person argues with another person, one person curses another person, one person intends to do harm. So you can come to the temple, to the Beit HaMikdash, and one of the purposes is V'ata tishva hashamayim, and you, the heavens, will hear in order to judge. That's number one. B'nagei famcha Yisrael lifnei oyev. When the people of Israel fall in battles, They will come and return to you to the temple. V'hodu et shmecha. They will acknowledge your name, pray, and ask for forgiveness. V'ata tishma shamayim, and you will listen the heavens, and you will there forgive to those who have sinned. Because in biblical times, the reason that you lose a battle is because you've sinned. It's obvious. 35, when the rains, when the sky closes and the rains do not come, for you've sinned, for they sinned to you, they will pray in this place and acknowledge your name, and from there they will do teshuvah, because you will answer them. V'ata tishma shamayim. You will hear the heavens. It's you will hear in heavens, but this is how the poetry is going. V'ata tishma shamayim. And you will forgive. And not only when it's rain and the drought, but also when it's famine, when it's a ra'av. And then there's pestilence, and there's locusts and caterpillars and all the different types of plagues. What will happen? Obviously, people will come to the temple, call out your name. And verse 39, V'ata tishma shamayim, and you will hear from the heavens, in order that people will fear you all the days upon which you live. Right? Now, this seems to be a mini conclusion, right? Because for the last 3 or 4 times, it's been, when this happens, you will hear, and then they will return to you, and this will happen, and you will hear, and you will hear, and you will hear. And all of a sudden, in this this mini break, which I think is significant, he kind of gives a summary. Leman, in order. Why are we setting this whole thing up? Why is there a temple? Why is there God, the process of listening and hearing and doing and acting, responding? The answer is, Yiraucha kol hayamim. So people will fear God all their days, which seems fairly obvious. If you know that there's God in the temple, then that will be ingrained in you, and you will recognize that you live in the land of Israel, and you have a special relationship, and you're not too far away from having that spiritual encounter. And then Shlomo HaMelech says something fantastic. He says, you think the temple is only for the Jewish people? Verse 41. V'gam el anochri asher lo amcha Yisrael hu, uvam eretz rechoka leman shemecha. Let's not forget the stranger who's not from the people of Israel. And he's going to come from far away. Why? Because they'll hear about your great name and your outstretched arm. And what's he going to do? He's going to come to this house and he's going to pray. Here, Shlomo introduces the notion that the temple of Israel was not only for the Jewish people. Now, it wasn't first on the list, the non-Jews, right? That they came after several explanations of what the purpose is. But nevertheless, it's there. It's there to say that that Solomon has created a house that God's name should go out throughout the whole land. And if God's name goes out, you should expect that people who are not from the Jewish people will join and become part of this process of calling out to God's name. Don't worry, he says, Ata tishma shamayim. You will listen to them as well. Everything that the foreigner says, so that they will know your name, and they will fear you like the nation of Israel, to know your name on this house upon which I built. Then he continues and says, when there's a battle, they'll come and pray at the temple, and that's what they did. Every time there was a battle, they first came to the temple and prayed that it should go well. And what happens in verse 45 is Shamata Hashamai. The heavens will hear. And when they sin in a terrible sin, because after all, everyone sins at some point, and you deliver them from their enemies, and this kind of like is a bit of repetition, they will return from the land in which they were carried off and imprisoned. V'hitchanenu elecha ba'aretz shovehem lemor, and they will ask for forgiveness in the land where they are. And they will do tshuva, and they will return from the land that they were in and pray to you in direction of the land that you gave to the forefathers. Here is the source that Jews pray towards Eretz Yisrael and towards Yerushalayim, right here. Towards the temple. And what are you guys going to do? V'shamata hashamayim. You are going to hear from the heavens. V'salachta la'amcha, and you will forgive. Now, how is King Solomon saying? Well, that's because this is how God set up the temple, according to how Solomon presents it. The temple is a place where Solomon teaches the people that God makes a special presence, that people can come there. And they will be forgiven if they do it justly and sincerely. For they are your very own people whom you freed from the iron furnace. This is another expression of Egypt. It's called the iron furnace that they had to go through in order to come out and become God's people. May your eyes be open to the prayers of your servants and the prayers of your people Israel, and may you listen to them whenever they call out to you. For after all, you've set them apart from all the nations, just like you told Moses when you took him out of Egypt. This is the conclusion of the speech. It starts out, talking about God's promise to David. It continues talking about the fulfillment of that promise at the time of Solomon. And then Solomon lays it out because God told him this is what it's about. And he kind of calls him to task. And he says, okay, this is the temple. And you know what his purpose is? For you to listen to us. Now, yes, of course, we need to do our part of the bargain. We need to pray to God. We need to ask for your supplication. We need to do tshuva. We need to do it sincerely. But if we do, you got to keep your part of the bargain, listening and acting. When we have, when we need judgment, and when we need rain, and when we need to be saved from plagues, and when we sinned and we asked to do tshuva, repentance, all that. The magic, the power of the Beit HaMikdash is this, not in sacrificing, not in miracles that are taking place. It is that this is a place where the Jews will know that they can come to call out to God, and God will hear. And then he says, by the way, it's not only the Jews. And then he says, yes, but the Jews are special because you have separated them, just like you told Moses. And that's why this temple is predominantly for the Jewish people, but not exclusively. And that's how he concludes his speech. And when he concluded his speech, praying to God, all of the prayers and the supplications, he stood before the holy altar where he was kneeling when he did this whole, and he spread his hands towards the heavens, And he said, and he blessed the entire nation, saying, Baruch Adonai asher natan menucha lamo Yisrael kechol asher diber lo nafal davar echad michol dvaro hatov asher dibir biad Moshe Avdo. Praise be the Lord. Blessed is the Lord who granted peace to his nation Israel, just as he promised. And not a single word has he failed from what he said he was going to do to Moshe the prophet. May God be with us, just like he was with our forefathers. May he never abandon or forsake us. May he listen to our hearts. May we walk in his ways and keep his commandments, the laws and rules that he gave to our forefathers. And may the words of mine, which I offered in supplication before God, be close to God day and night. And he should provide his servant for his people Israel according to each day needs. Why? Leman dat kol amei haaretz ki Adonai hu Elohim ein od. In order that all the nations of the world should know that God is the true God and there is no other. And may you be wholehearted with the Lord, O God. He's speaking now to the people, to walk in his ways and keep his commandments, even like just today. They offered sacrifices, an enormous number, 22,000, 120,000 sheep. And on that day, the king sanctified the center of the court that is in front of the house of the Lord. For there he presented the burnt offerings and the meal offerings and the fats because the bronze altar was too small, but this he used the burnt altar. And finally, at that time, Shlomo made the holiday of Sukkot, Chag, 7 days, and another 7 days, which was unusual. I mean, I don't know exactly what that's about, that Shlomo was able to make a 14-day Chag. But nevertheless, he did it as if to say, this is a once-in-a-lifetime moment that is supposed to be celebrated not once, but twice. And on the 8th day, he sends the people away, and they bless the king, and everyone goes to their tents, joyous, glad in their hearts for all the goodness that God had shown to David, his servant, and to Israel, his people. And therein we conclude the 8th chapter. This was a pretty long one, and it was one in which, as I said, King Shlomo is doing what he's supposed to be doing, and he's saying what he's supposed to be saying, and he's reminding the people of what their commitment should be and what the responsibilities are. And in so doing, you create a covenant. Covenant is a relationship that's built on love, respect, but responsibility as well. Reward, punishment, in order to refine the relationship, in order to make sure that it is going in the right direction. And the temple is a manifestation of that. It's God saying, I will put up, I'll walk the walk, as you say, right? Not just talking that you're my people, but I will actually listen to you and respond to you from this place. And that is truly what made the Beit HaMikdash such a significant place in the history of the Jewish people. And it was able to be done on a quite auspicious day by a great king who is the son of the greatest king, who is going to continue in the ways of his father for now, and who is going to spread the word, the name of God, to all around him. And that's how the 8th chapter concludes.